witches.
Hello, welcome back to another history episode where today, because we finished The Witch and the Tsar, um, we're going to talk about Ivan the Terrible, because he was in fact a historical figure, and what we just read was a historical fiction, um, with some embellishment here and there, but we are going to talk about Ivan the Terrible today. So,
Unrelated but kind of related.
uh-huh.
I also got this book. It's
Ooh,
called Becoming Baba Yaga, and it's about like the mythology and not only about Baba Yaga and her mythology, but like also it says places her in a modern context, not as merely a witch of the woods, but also as an archetype and an impetus for finding your own path.
oh, that's cute. I love
I'm
that.
excited to read it. So
Yeah. It's like I wouldn't call it like a self-help book, but is it similar to like a self-help book, like
kind
not like a
of,
fiction?
yeah. Yeah. Like a witchy, like it was in
Yeah.
the witchy section of the store.
Mm-hmm. I don't dare go into a bookstore right now. I have so many books on my TBR, and I have the attention span of a goldfish, so
Valid.
I can't read more than one book at a time. I've tried and I have failed multiple times. So, but yeah, so we're going to start off where this boy is going to grow into a ruler whose name still vibrates with dread. Ivan the Fourth Vasilyevich. Um, I hate when I can't.
Oh, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, Vasilyevich, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Um, Though, as we learned in the book, The Witch and the Tsar, he was actually known as Ivan Grozny. And Grozny means fearsome, the formidable, or like one who inspires. So Ivan Grozny was his name. But we're not going to just tell his story from start to finish. We're actually going to dissect it a little bit. So we're going to talk about the psychology about it, politically, and a little bit mythically, maybe. I mean, his he's basically legendary, whether it's good or bad. We have talked about him for years. Um, he's written into pop culture, books, all of that kind of stuff. So he is a historical figure that has made some type of impact that made him kind of, beyond. Was that a cat?
That was chaos.
That sounded like a creaky old door, like in a haunted like house opening up.
Yeah, it did.
Um, but so it's basically we're going to talk more on like how himself was treated as a child and how that is like a case study for trauma and how sometimes trauma becomes policy and how paranoia becomes governance and how a child abandoned in a palace becomes a ruler who abandons his people. So it's like it's going to humanize him a bit. He was a terrible fucking person, but it's going to humanize him a bit. It's going to like give you a different side of things
I mean,
and be
it's so
like,
different than like a serial killer documentary where they tell you
yeah,
about their sad childhood and then tell you about
yeah,
all the shitty stuff they did.
yeah. So it's going to humanize him a bit. So yeah. Anyways, so we're going to start with the upbringing. So he was born on August 25th, 1530, into the ancient Rurikid dynasty. So Ruriks were the dynasty that basically ruled Russia for like 500 years. It stretched back to the Viking founders of Russia, or Rus, as a lot of people call it. So his birth was quite celebrated as the arrival of stability. He was a future czar and a symbol of continuity. But the world he entered into was already cracking. I mean, it's 1530. Things aren't going great, no matter where you're at. There's all kinds of shit happening, and Russia has some of the bloodiest history. If anyone ever takes a deep dive into some of Russia's history from start to beginning or start to end or to current day time, there is a lot of bloodshed and a lot of death regardless of the bloodshed. So let's talk about fractures. So the first fracture in his life was Vasily III's death, so his father. His father died when Ivan was just 3 years old. So his mother, Elena Galinskaya, became regent. She was young, politically sharp, and immediately controversial because a woman being a regent in this time, unfathomable. She tried to modernize the state and reform the currency and protect her sons. But as with any good monarchy of the time in Russia, and also a woman, she was surrounded by enemies. 1538, just 8 years after um, Ivan was born, Elena died suddenly. Chroniclers whispered of poisoning of some sort. Modern historians still kind of debate it. There's not scientific evidence dating back then that shows this is in fact what happened. She wasn't obviously stabbed. She just mysteriously died. Um, but what matters the most is that Ivan believed that the boyars murdered his mother.
And
And
probably
that,
did.
yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, and there's reason behind it. Like, this belief became quite the seed in his lifelong paranoia. So let's talk about the political predators circling the throne at this time. So with Elena gone, the Kremlin transformed into a palace, the palace into a battlefield. The boyar clans, the powerful aristocratic families, tore into each other for control of the child. We've seen it in like History Channel when they talk about like medieval history in Europe. We've seen it all. Like it's not uncommon. Their motives
History
were
does
obviously
repeat itself.
yeah. Their motives were survival, dominance, and proximity to power. As with any Aristotle, wrong,
Aristocracy?
yeah, aristocracy. There is always the motive to survive, to dominate, and proximity to power. I mean, if anyone ever talked about like Henry VIII and like his 6 wives, there's a reason why each one of these wives were like, before they were wives, they came from a type of background that got them into the midst of the king
Mm-hmm.
that led to them becoming the next wife. That's kind of how this whole thing is. So some of the clans were the Suiski clan. They were considered the opportunists. They descended from the Ruikids themselves. They believed that they had legitimate claim to the throne, and they moved fast. They seized control of the Kremlin Guard. They instantly they installed allies in key positions. Keep an eye out on, history repeating itself nowadays in America. They were undermining rival clans, and they were treating Ivan as a ceremonial puppet. So their motive was to restore their branch of dynasty to power. And their method was to destabilize the regency and weaken the child heir to get them up into the power. The next clan is the Belsky clan. They were the strategists, or considered the strategists. They were politically savvy. They were less violent, but equally ambitious. They positioned themselves as protectors of the young prince, but their protection was strategic enough. They had influence over Ivan's education. They had control of the treasury, and they had leverage over foreign policy. Now, 1500s didn't see a lot of foreign policy, but it was enough to be significant at this point. I just got a text from Will saying Scarlett desperately wants in there. She's outside the door.
These animals, man.
I know. Ever since I became pregnant, she's just been like, Mom, you're my only one. Please protect me. Anyways, so their motive was to become kingmakers. Their method was to manipulate the child and control the court, which that seems more of like the right way to do it. Like obviously they're the strategists, but like that seems more of the right strategy that would win,
Right.
Now the Glinskys, who were known as the Fallen Power. Now the Glinskys were Ivan's mother's clan. So her last name were the Glinskayas. So she was part of the Glinsky clan. They were foreign-born and deeply resented, probably because they weren't Russian-born, whatever the case is. So after Elena's death, they were quite targeted. They were imprisoned, they were exiled, they were executed. Their motive was just to survive. Their method was to cling to whatever that influence still remained for them to, like, stay relevant. And it's so weird knowing a little bit about Russian history because that's kind of what happened. Not what happened, but that's similar to how Stalin took power when he became
Oh,
president. He basically exiled, executed, and imprisoned anyone that could take his power, and he basically did everything else. Like, so he was all three of these things. Um, and they fought so brutally because in the 1930s, Russia wasn't a stable monarchy yet. They had been, in power for X amount of years, but it was still a growing country. It wasn't stable enough. It was small in comparison to what it is now. So it was basically just a battlefield of competing aristocracies all over the place. And whoever controlled the child controlled the army, the treasury, the church, foreign alliances, and the future of the state. And that would help them stay in power. And so
this is
Ivan wasn't,
so fucked.
I know. So here's the thing. Ivan wasn't a child to them. He was a resource. He was a means
Uh-huh.
to the end, basically. So resources can be exploited, starved, beaten, or ignored. And he was a resource. So let's just paint a picture. Like, let's get into some of our feels here. Now, these are stories that are created, not accurate. Would like to put that out
Okay.
there. This is just to kind of like imagine what life could have been like for Tsar back in his childhood. So you're in a hallway that's dim with torchlight. You hear the boyars feasting loudly, tearing through the roasted meat, drinking special wine. You are a child, a small boy, barefoot, clothes frayed, and a servant approaches a noble with a tray, and the noble backhands him so hard the tray crashes to the ground and laughter erupts. Ivan flinches, as a scared child would do, and a boyar
Makes
notices
sense.
him. Oh, little prince, you look hungry. And he tosses a bone towards him. Now, Ivan, he's probably smart at this age. He knows if I do that, they're going to laugh at me more. He knows it's a trap. And basically, he is like, oh, not so mighty now, huh? Like, because he's starving, he's afraid or whatever. Ivan is upset. He says nothing, though, but he remembers this moment. So that is just starving him, basically. Let's talk about possible beatings. Ivan hides behind a column, and his caretaker, who's gentle, loyal, is dragged into the courtyard by armed boyars. They accuse him of disloyalty, even though everyone knows the real reason. He was too close to the prince. He was too close. He was a liability. So Fyodor is beaten. We're just gonna call him Fyodor because that was a Russian name I came up with. Not quickly, not mercifully, methodically.
Ugh.
And then just picture it, Ivan's watching this,
And he's what?
trembling,
How old at this point? Like 9?
probably 9, 10. He's young. Um, so these are like fantasized stories of what he witnessed. So like he
Right.
witnessed things
Okay.
like this,
So
but these are
through
like
his
just
whole childhood.
fantasized. Yeah, like these are just fantasized. Like
Yeah.
I was literally reading like, oh, these are the things that he witnessed, and I was like, oh, let's write a story about it because why not?
He could have been any age, could have been seeing
Yeah,
these
yeah.
type things.
So Ivan's watching this. He's trembling. He's like, doing the whole like thing. He wants to scream. He's upset. He wants to run to help him. He knows what happens to children who intervene. He also would get beaten. So when the boys leave, the man is barely conscious. Or when the boyars leave, not the boys, sorry. When the boyars leave, the man's barely conscious, laying there, dying, basically. Ivan doesn't understand
Especially
any of
on top
this,
of like, and
but
I
he
know this is
remembers.
like just a story, but like it's probably something that truly
This could have
happened.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And on top of like his caretaker at this point is probably the one person that like shows him any affection or love. And he's already watched both of his parents die. And now he's like watching the one person who cares for him
Get the
in his
shit kicked
mind
out of him.
probably being murdered. Like,
Yeah. So like he doesn't understand, but he remembers. And here's the thing that you got to learn about child trauma. It doesn't matter if they understand or not. They may
mhm.
not understand it. And that's okay. But what you don't want to okay is the fact that they remember
Yeah, they'll internalize that shit.
and they will make it their own. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter any trauma that a child goes through. They remember the feeling, they remember what happened, and then they get kicked into survival mode. And that's kind of like the idea of this. And so in the book, we talked about, or we learned that Ivan also didn't have the soft spot for animals in his childhood, that he was known to murder animals in his childhood. Was it because he was sadistic in some way and he loved, hurting people? Or was it a trauma unfolding in real time, like learning? So just imagine he's at the top of the tower. He has an animal, a cat, a dog, a rat, whatever the fuck you want to call it, trembling in his hands. And he looks down at the courtyard far below and he just tosses it. What if he's
And
not
don't like it.
smiling? What if he's not considered cruel? What if he's just reenacting what he's seen before? He's like envisioning that he's not powerless. He can do the same thing. And Ivan watches, what if his face is blank, watching it happen, realizing the power that he holds by just doing what he just did? Would it be called sadism, or would it be a child trying to understand the power in the world where power that he's witnessed has only ever been violent? So you can sit there and say he was a terrible person, but what if this is just like, as a child, that's like where it starts. What if he was just reenacting what he's seen all his life and he was just testing that this is how I get power?
Right. And like that doesn't make it okay, but it does explain it. It
Yeah,
does make it make sense.
it helps you identify the psychological part of it all.
Yeah.
And there was a story, not a story, but there was also a time where they were locked in the room. Him and his brother Yuri were locked in rooms for hours. Um, no food, no water, no explanation. They would just be inside this room locked. Basically, boyars threatening, yelling, screaming, plotting, fighting, whatever it is. So he just sits there and listens. He hears the political violence happening right outside. He learns who hates who. And I mean, that's the whole idea of court. You learn who hates who to side with, who not to side with, like who's about to fall off the bandwagon, who's about to survive and like win this argument. Like you learn the ins and outs of courts. That's just how court is. Um, and he learns silence and at this time because you have to observe what is happening outside this door while you're locked into this room kind of thing. But most of all, after all of these things, being locked in a room, starved, and beaten, he learns fear and he remembers. So he knows all of these things that happen to him are keys to getting power. So let's think about it. He's got attachment trauma. Ivan's early years were defined by loss of both parents, inconsistent caregivers, violent authority figures, and chronic neglect. This kind of created a disorganized attachment where caregivers are both comforting and dangerous. It leads to emotional volatility, difficulty trusting, hypervigilance, aggression as self-protection, and probably a little bit of that, paranoia. And so that's kind of where the paranoia comes in. It grows from that unpredictable environment that he, had as a child, the betrayal that he witnessed, the witnessing violence, often daily almost, and the lack of safety that he felt throughout his most formative years, where that is most important. So it wasn't necessarily irrational or like a form of like, when somebody is just born and they're just like schizophrenic from the get-go, and that's like where the paranoia comes from. This is adaptive paranoia. This is something that he learned to survive.
Like nature versus nurture kind of vibes.
Yeah. And children who grow up powerless often develop obsession with control, fear of vulnerability, desire to dominate environments. So Ivan's later brutality wasn't necessarily a departure from his childhood. It was a logical extension of it. So that power fixation kind of helped define how he was as a ruler in his later years. He also had a religious intensity. So his education was obviously not his to control, nor his parents. It was the boyars. And the boyars ensured that his education emphasized divine right, apocalyptic imagery, saints who suffered and triumphed. And so this created a worldview where he was chosen by God. His enemies were agents of evil, and violence could be righteous. So let's move on to the next one. He was a child who was brilliant. He was well educated. He was well read. He was well knowledgeable of what was available to him at that time. He was sensitive. He obviously knew fear. He knew sadness. He knew all of these other things. He was a child, for God's sakes. But he was observant. So he learned all of those things while also being observant. But because of all of that, in the sensitivity that he faced, he was easily wounded and he was quick to rage. He was desperate for affection because as a child growing up without his parents, or even consistent caregivers. Because here's the thing, if you're caregivers, or if you're made to be a caregiver of him and you are often beaten or whatever because you get too close to him, you're not going to be as affectionate to him.
Uh-huh.
So he's desperate for affection at this point, and he's terrified of betrayal because of the mass amounts of betrayal that he faced throughout his lifetime. So this duality of tenderness and terror kind of shaped the ruler that he became. So when we see in the book how he went from this awe-inspiring ruler to this terrified child having child regression, that's the duality that we see. We see the irrational form of him not understanding anything that's going on. And all of this happened before he was 16. So at the age of 16, he spent well over a decade watching adults fight for control of him. He was ignored, abused, manipulated, and used as a political pawn. So when he was crowned himself Tsar of all Russia on January 16th, 1547, it wasn't just a ceremony. This was a reclamation. It was a declaration, a revenge. He chose the title Tsar deliberately, a word echoing Caesar, empire, divine authority. And no ruler prior to him had dared to claim it before, Tsar of all Russia. He wasn't just stepping into power, he was redefining it. And for that moment, he became the ruler Russia desperately needed. I mean, they're all good at one point, right?
They all start out with the right intentions, at least not all, I guess, but
yeah. What they believe are the right intentions, let's be real. So just months after his coronation, there was a major fire. And in the book, we actually learn about this. So when Yaga gets to Moscow, she sees basically everything's made of wood and there's consistent fires throughout the summer, all the time. So just months after his coronation, Moscow was in flames. A massive fire tore through the city, destroying homes, markets, churches, everything. Panic had spread and rumors sort of followed. And in the smoke, the people turned on the Glinsky clan. Now, remember, the Glinsky is a part of of his mother's side. And so they were accused of sorcery, treason, and sabotage. And now they were well hated because they were foreign-born. This was the perfect reason to turn on them. So, as one does with their influence, they can start a mob. So a mob stormed the Kremlin and they demanded blood. They wanted the Glinskys dead because this horrible, non-sorcery-based thing happened to them. But Ivan stepped forward. Ivan actually stopped this. He was young, newly crowned, traumatized, but he was determined and he faced the crowd. Chroniclers describe him speaking with a calm authority that stunned even his enemies. He had promised justice, protection, and order, and this moment mattered in this circumstance. It was the first time Ivan had used his voice not as a frightened child, but as a ruler. So this kind of helped define him as a ruler, and that the people listened to him. So after the fire, Ivan actually began shaping a circle of advisors who would guide him through what historians would call the good years. This wasn't a formal institution. It was kind of like a group of people of voices that Ivan trusted, each offering something he had never truly known as a child, that stability, that structure, and that counsel without the cruelty. At the center of this was the Chosen Council, or a group that included, and we know these characters, Alexei Adashev.
Uh-oh.
He was the brilliant administrator, disciplined and fiercely loyal, which is probably why we saw Vasily fiercely loyal to certain people. Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who was a gifted military commander and one of Ivan's closest confidants. Somebody called Metropolitan Macarius, who was a spiritual architect of Ivan's religious worldview. So I had to look up basically what the Metropolitan meant, because I'm thinking like a metropolis in a way.
Right.
But it's basically a leader of the church. It's somebody that you
Okay.
have to like grow into, and Macarius actually ended up becoming a saint. He was inducted into sainthood, probably in the Orthodox Christianity world, but not necessarily in like what we know in America. Um, but I would call it more like a pope or like an
Okay.
archbishop in a way,
A little more
kind of
power.
thing. Yeah, a little more power, a little more ability to mold certain things, but not like a priest. And we also have Sylvester. So we learned about Sylvester from the book as well. He was an archpriest of the Annunciation Cathedral and the conscience of the council. So he helped keep everybody aligned. Um, Now each one had like their own little like reason for being on the council. But one person we never actually learned about from the book, and the reason why I chose Sylvester was because we know about him from the book. We learned a little bit about Alexei, but we didn't really learn much about Sylvester. He wasn't a character that we got to meet. So I looked a little bit more into him. So he wasn't a boyar or a general at all. He had no political faction, no land, no army, no nothing. Um, he was just the calm, steady voice that spoke without fear or manipulation. He is described as a man who could walk into Ivan's presence during moments of panic or rage and speak to him as if he were simply a young man, not a Tsar. So he urged Ivan towards justice, humility, mercy, restraint, and spiritual reflection. So after the fire of 1547, when Moscow burned and the people demanded blood, Sylvester was one of the few figures who could steady Ivan's temper. He redirected Ivan's fear into reform rather than revenge, and encouraging him to rebuild the city, strengthen the governance, and focus on the welfare of his people. He was actually crucial. His presence was crucial because he represents the light in Ivan's early reign, proof that future tyrant once listened to gentler voices and that those voices mattered. And it also kind of helps humanize Ivan a little bit more, because if you have somebody gentle speaking to you, you're going to be more likely to listen to them. um, But here's a little bit about the council's impact and like his era of reform. So, with Sylvester's moral guidance, Adashev's administrative brilliance, Kurbsky's military strategy, and Macarius's spiritual authority, the chosen council helped Ivan revise the legal code, called the Sudebnik of 1550, create the Streltsy, or Russians' first standing army, convene the first Zemsky Sobor, or a national assembly, strengthen local governance, reduce corruption, and modernize the military service class. So this was the era where Ivan looked like a visionary ruler. He was thoughtful, reform-minded, and capable of building a modern state. And Sylvester, Adashev, and Kurbsky, and Macarius are some of the pillars just holding this version of Ivan together, which is kind of the idea that we got from the book as well. When we learned about them, like, we learned that these were his chosen confidants. And then once they were kicked to the curb by whatever reason, which we know is Koshi's reason, um, he started kind of going down. So that's kind of like the idea that his reign was going to be wonderful for the people. And Ivan actually had some great victories at this time too. In 1552 he launched a campaign against the Khanate of Kazan, a powerful Tatar state that had raided Russian lands for centuries. So the siege was brutal, complex, and strategically daring, but Ivan personally led the army. He prayed before battle, he carried icons into the field. He believed the conquest was divinely ordained. And when Kazan fell, it was a seismic moment in Russian history because the Volga River came under Russian control, Tatar raids diminished, and Russia expanded eastward. Ivan also became a hero to his people. And the Volga River is a huge river in Russia, so that just helped increase trade for the Russian people. So this victory transformed Russia from that fragmented medieval principality to a rising empire and modernized, helped not modernize, but help move it further along in terms of like industriousness. So it transformed Ivan from a traumatized boy to a triumphant ruler. So it's like a rags to riches kind of moment where you're just like, wow, he took all of this grief and he turned it into something good. And he continued that. So in 1556, Ivan captured Astrakhan or whatever, completing Russian. I don't know what word that is from. I don't know if it's like Kazakhstan kind of word or if it's like a different, like a Mongolian kind of word. I don't know where that word is, so I don't know. Anyways, he took over this place, completing Russia's dominance of the Volga River. So this open trade routes to Central Asia had helped strengthen Russia's economic position. So for the first time at this point in history, Russia looked outward toward the empire, expansion, and influence. So Ivan's early reign wasn't just competent, it was visionary for his time. Now, amongst the reforms and victories, Ivan married Anastasia Romanova, who we all know from the story as the light of his life, the one who was able to calm him down during all of these, tirades of his. But chroniclers described her as gentle, intelligent, and stabilizing. Their marriage is one of the few relationships in Ivan's life described as genuinely loving. She softened him, she steadied him, she encouraged his better nature, and under her influence, Ivan was more patient, more rational, less paranoid, and more open to counsel. So, for a moment, Ivan finally had what he never known as a child was safety, affection, and trust, and Russia flourished. And it wasn't anything, like there was nothing on her end that she wasn't getting anything in return. She wasn't a pawn that we're aware of that was faking all the way through it. However, as we learn in the story with the witch and the Tsar, there was some foreshadowing of what's to come for Anastasia. So Sylvester's influence depended on Ivan's emotional stability, and the stability depended on Anastasia. So when Anastasia died in 1560, Ivan's grief shattered the delicate balance of his early reign. Sylvester's voice, once powerful enough to calm the Tsar, began to fade, and Ivan grew suspicious of him. Eventually, Sylvester was accused of sorcery and forced into monastic exile. The loss of Sylvester wasn't just political, it was psychological, it was spiritual, and it was the extinguishing of one of the last lights in Ivan's life. And once that light went out, the shadows start taking over. And at this point, we already know in the book that it was Koshi who had driven them away before Anastasia passed. However, Anastasia died first, and then that's when everybody else started, like, moving away, essentially. So we're going to talk about the breaking point of Alexander. So for more than a decade, Ivan had lived in a fragile equilibrium. The chosen council steadied him. Sylvester calmed him, Adashev guided him, and Anastasia, gentle, intelligent, grounding Anastasia, had softened him in ways no other advisor ever could. She was the first person in Ivan's life who loved him without fear, without manipulation, and without political motive, but because she fell ill in 1560, things kind of went bad. And at first it seemed like a fever, but then it worsened. Anastasia grew weak, pale, unable to eat. Ivan stayed at her bedside, praying, pacing, begging God for mercy. Chroniclers describe him weeping openly, something he rarely allowed himself to do. And the court whispered, and the boyars watched. Of course they did. And the chosen council grew anxious, and then Anastasia died. Uh-oh. Ivan's grief was immediate, violent, and consuming. But beneath the grief was something older, something buried since childhood, something that now surged to the surface with terrifying force. Ivan had become. I don't like when people walk right outside my window. Like, there is a reason. There is no pathway outside my window. I just see a body go by, and I'm like, what the fuck? Who are you? It's just terrifying. Anyways, Ivan became convinced that Anastasia was poisoned. Now, remember, he fully believed the boyars poisoned his mother, and the last light in his life, Anastasia, his wife, his darling, wonderful, supportive wife, died. And he believes she had been poisoned by the boyars. So the same nobles who had starved him, mocked him, beaten his caretakers, and murdered his mother now are back in the hot seat for murdering his wife. So whether Anastasia was poisoned or not, Ivan believed with his whole being that they murdered his wife, whether or not that was the truth, whether or not that actually happened, whether or not she wasn't poisoned by somebody unknown or by them. He didn't care. The boyars did it, and they were going to pay. So this is kind of the start of the psychological collapse that we see. Her death cracked him open. Everything that he had built, the reforms, the stability, the trust, everything began to unravel. He lashed out at his advisors. He accused nobles of treason. He withdrew from the council. He oscillated between rage and despair. He prayed obsessively. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. And he stopped trusting. So Sylvester's calming voice no longer reached him. Adashev's discipline no longer anchored him. Kurbsky's loyalty no longer reassured him. And the trauma of his childhood surged back like a tidal wave. So Ivan began to behave like the frightened, furious child that he once was. But now he had absolute power. He wasn't powerless at this point, and he remembered the banquet hall, the beatings, the locked rooms, the lack of food, the mockery, the boyars laughing, the helplessness, the fear. And he vowed to never feel powerless again. So chroniclers describe Ivan's transformation as sudden, but psychologically it was inevitable. The loss of Anastasia removed the last emotional barrier between Ivan and his trauma. He began to see enemies everywhere. He began to hear betrayal in every whisper. He began to imagine conspiracies in every shadow, and he began to plan something new, something unprecedented, something terrifying. A system built not on reform, but on fear, because that is how he was raised. It was not going to be on counsel, but on obedience, and not on trust, but on terror. He created the Oprichnina, which we learned in the book is terrifying. So from 1568 to 1572, the Oprichnina survived. In 1565, Ivan announced the creation of the Oprichnina, or a word that meant apart or separate or set aside. And that's exactly what it was. A state within a state ruled directly by Ivan, enforced by his personal army, the Oprichniki. This was not a political reform. This was a psychological project and a trauma-driven empire. So the Oprichniki were unlike any force Russia had ever seen. They wore black, they rode horses, they shaved their heads, and they carried dog heads and brooms on their saddles. The dog heads symbolized sniffing out treason. The brooms symbolized sweeping away enemies. But they weren't soldiers, they were not guards, they were just instruments of fear. Ivan had handpicked them, he had trained them, he had indoctrinated them, and he had unleashed them on Russia as we know it at this time. So Ivan carved out a massive portion of Russia, including some of its wealthiest lands, and declared it his personal domain. The rest of Russia became the Zemshchina, or governed by traditional boyar structures. So the Oprichnina was economically disruptive, politically destabilizing, socially catastrophic, and psychologically devastating. It was a kingdom of fear inside a kingdom of fear, which never ends well. So the terror begins. The Oprichniki began confiscating boyar estates, executing nobles and torturing suspected traitors and relocating entire families, which we kind of see in The Witch and the Tsar, how Adashev was sent to exile to live in a house by himself while his family was removed and left away. And Vasily's family was basically suspected of being traitors, regardless if they were or not, and they were all fucking murdered. So, like, we saw it in the book, and that's just one of the things that they did in real life. Ivan had encouraged the Oprichniki to spy on people, to interrogate, to punish and destroy, much like ICE is doing today. He rewarded cruelty, he celebrated brutality, and he sanctified violence. He wanted it to happen. So imagine like a procession of Oprichniki. You have men dressed in black on horses with dog heads, just riding through Moscow at dawn. Bells were ringing from their belts to signify that they were coming. People hide behind their shutters. Children are pulled indoors. Merchants immediately close their stalls. Priests avert their eyes, and they pass silently, except for the sound of the hooves and the bells and the dog heads swinging. This was a warning, not an army marching through. It was a warning of basically what was to come. What the fuck? Somebody just messaged me. I hate that. The fuck messaged me. Okay, anyways. So that was in 1665 when all of this happened. But we're going to fast forward 5 years to 1570 when the massacre of Novgorod happened. So one of the darkest chapters of the Oprichnina came when Ivan accused Novgorod, a wealthy semi-autonomous city, of plotting treason. So Ivan marched there with the Oprichniki and had a weeks-long massacre occur. Families were drowned in the river. Priests were tortured. Merchants were executed. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Thousands were killed. Chroniclers described the river freezing over with bodies because it's cold and the water is icy. So when you have so many bodies in the water and they're just icing over, and so now you have a bridge of bodies to get from one side to the other because of how many bodies were in a fucking icy river. It's insane. And Novgorod never recovered from that. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't either.
I don't think
so
I'm
like
gonna
that
recover.
happened. And then the Livonian War happened. So this is kind of like an external collapse that happened. So while terror consumed Russia internally, Ivan decided to launch the Livonian War to gain access to the Baltic Sea. It dragged on for decades, draining the treasury and ended in failure. Not only did Russia lose, they lost territory, prestige, and economic stability. The combination of internal terror and external disaster plunged the country into famine, poverty, and despair. So let's talk about the psychological logic of the Oprichnina. It was not random cruelty. The trauma was made politically. Ivan recreated the fear of his childhood, reversed the power dynamic, and became the boyar's tormentor. They punished the nobles who had once punished him, and he built a world where he could never again be powerless. This is just a childhood fantasy coming to life of the trauma that he endured. And the Oprichnina was the palace of his childhood turned inside out. So they were the ones who able to help him can make this a thing. But by 1572, they had become unsustainable. So the economy was collapsing and the military was weakened. So with the people starving, even though Oprichniki had become unpredictable, he dissolved them. But the damage at this point was already done. Russia would never be the same. Ivan would never be the same. And the trauma had become the state. Ooh. So by the early 1570s, Ivan IV was no longer the promising young Tsar guided by reformers and spiritual advisors. The Oprichnina had consumed the country. The Livonian War had drained the treasury. Famine and disease stalked the land, and Ivan himself, once brilliant, curious, and capable of restraint, was unraveling. The trauma of his childhood had become the architecture of his governance, so the paranoia that once lived in his mind now lived in the state. The rage that once simmered in his heart now burned across Russia, and the consequences were catastrophic. So the terror he had unleashed weakened the military, destabilized the economy, and turned entire regions against him. So the Oprichnina became unstable. Um, the Crimean Tatars exploited the chaos and invaded, burning Moscow in 1571.
I'm sorry. Did you just say the cream and tartars?
Crimean, Crimean,
Okay. Okay.
Crimean Tatar,
The cream and tartars.
Tatar. Maybe it's Tatar. I don't know.
The cream and
Anyways,
tartars.
so the Oprichniki, who were once Ivan's instruments of fear, actually became unpredictable and violent toward each other. Their loyalty was performative, and their brutality was self-serving. So Ivan dissolved the Oprichnina, but dissolving the system of terror does not erase its consequences. So the scars of the people remained, and it didn't help that you have invaders coming into Moscow, also burning everything down. So not only did Ivan relive his childhood after his wife died, he literally made Russia feel the exact same way that he felt growing up. Like, how it to me is honestly insane how one person can create an entire like world of tragedy. Not tragedy, but can make an entire country feel how he felt as a child. Like, it's insane.
Mm-hmm.
The like all of it. So let's talk about his son. So we learned in The Witch and the Tsar that Ivan's son died. So this is kind of a tragedy that also defined him. So in 1851, Ivan's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He suspected treason everywhere, in the boyars, in the clergy, in foreign ambassadors, and even in his own family. So one day, Ivan discovered his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, arguing with one of the Tsar's advisors. The younger Ivan was furious about the suffering of the people and the mismanagement of the war. So he confronted his father, and that argument escalated, much like what happened in the story. So Ivan the Terrible was exhausted, paranoid, trembling with rage, had struck his son with his staff, and the blow was fatal. Chroniclers describe the scene with haunting detail. Ivan was cradling his dying son, screaming, sobbing, begging God for mercy, and the future of Russia bleeding out in his arms. The Tsar's face twisted in horror as he realized what he had done, and in this moment, it was immortalized centuries later in Ilya Repin's painting, which is the emotional core of Ivan's downfall. He didn't just kill his son; he killed his heir. He killed Russia's future. What would befall Russia if he were to die? So he killed the last person who might have saved him from himself. So we'll talk a little bit about how the Tsar is surrounded by, ghosts in his final years, basically. So after his son's death, Ivan became a ghost of the man he once was. He withdrew from public life. He obsessed over religious rituals. He alternated between manic generosity and violent outbursts. He executed advisors on suspicion alone. He rewrote wills, laws, and succession plans repeatedly. And he suffered from chronic illness, possibly mercury poisoning, which also may have contributed to his, not necessarily paranoia, but his outbursts. Because he was surrounded by fear, not by loyalty, by sycophants and not counselors, and by memories, not hope. Russia suffered famine, economic collapse, and a military defeat. The Livonian War dragged on, draining what little remained of the treasury, and the people whispered that the Tsar was cursed. Ivan died on March 18th, 1584, reportedly after playing chess. Some accounts say he collapsed mid-move, others say he died in prayer. All agree on one thing: he died a man haunted by the ghosts that he had created and the lives that he took. But Ivan's death did not end the terror. It actually unleashed it, because his surviving son, Fyodor I, was gentle, pious, and utterly unprepared. Russia spiraled into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and dynastic collapse. So Ivan's legacy was not just a memory, it was a wound that Russia was not able to come back from right away. And we don't give a shit about Fyodor. So I didn't go into that, but anyways, so let's talk a little bit about the legacy that he leaves behind. It's one of the most paradoxical in world history. He was a visionary and a tyrant. He was a reformer and a destroyer. He had a brilliant mind that was shaped by trauma, but a traumatized mind that reshaped a nation. To understand his legacy, we got to look at what he built and what he broke. He strengthened the Russian state in ways that lasted centuries. The centralization of power. He broke the boyar's political dominance and established the principle that the Tsar's authority was absolute. He had territorial expansion. His conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan transformed Russia into a multi-ethnic empire and opened the path to Siberia. He had military and administrative reform. He created the Streltsy, modernized the service class, and established new legal codes. He also had the imperial ideology. By taking the title Tsar, Ivan positioned Russia as the successor to Rome and Byzantium, a divine empire with a sacred ruler. These achievements shaped the Russia of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and even the Romanov centuries later. But the cost of his terror also is what he broke. He created economic devastation, and the wounds he inflicted lasted just so long. So he created economic devastation because the Oprichnina destroyed agricultural regions, disrupted trade, and caused mass migrations. There was also political instability. His paranoia weakened institutions, eliminated competent advisors, and destabilized succession. There was social trauma. The massacres, mass executions, and forced relocations created generational fear and distrust. Because not only was he terrified as a child, he is now creating generations of terrified children during all of this. And in the times of trouble, Ivan's death left Russia leaderless, vulnerable, and fractured, again leading to famine, the Civil War, and foreign invasion. So his legacy was not just structural, it was psychological, unfortunately. So he was Ivan Grozny. often translated as terrible, but it was more Ivan the fearsome or the formidable. And in Russian cultural memory, Ivan becomes more than a historical figure. He actually becomes an archetype. The traumatized child who becomes a tyrant, the ruler who builds an empire through suffering, the man who embodies both the brilliance and brutality of autocracy. That does not sound right. But autocracy sounds worse. So
I think it's autocracy.
It's one of those words that you don't ever use often, and then when you like actually use it in the sense of that you're speaking, it just doesn't make sense. When you say it out loud, you're like, wait, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
Like it's the word that you're looking for, but it doesn't sound right. He is the shadow behind every strong man who came after him, the warning behind every centralized power, and the ghost in the architecture of Russian governments. So his story is not just about cruelty, it's about trauma, it's about power, it's about how fear becomes policy, how a child abandoned in a palace becomes a ruler who ends up abandoning his people in their most dire need. So his life asks a question that echoes across century. What happens when a nation gives absolute power to someone who has never known safety? And
Ba, ba,
honestly, it's
ba.
and the answer is written in the history that he left behind. So it's one of those things where you don't hear about it. It's not one of those things that you learn about in school, at
Right.
least in Americanized like thing. We don't learn about it. We hear about it. We learn about it through whatever means necessary, but it's not
Right. Like it's very glossed over. You hear about Ivan the Terrible, but you don't
you
that's
don't
all
like
I remember. That Ivan the Terrible in Russia. I don't remember
yeah,
what
like
he
we learned
did.
about it. We know that he was a terrible person, but that's all we know. We
Yeah.
didn't like this was more of a deep dive than I have ever learned in my entire life.
Same.
In like history lessons and all that. So psychologically speaking, this is a child that was strictly just traumatized beyond belief
It's really
based on
not
his
surprising at
childhood.
all based on his
No,
childhood that he turned out the way he did.
and it's so funny too, because like when you hear people talk about different things or history notes or whatever, you're like, oh, they're just a terrible fucking person. They were just born that way. And it's kind of like it comes back to like the innate evil, like that you're taught in school, like, oh, they got the devil in them. And it's like,
Right.
okay, but why?
Right.
Like
I
the
don't know
people who
about
ask
that.
why are the people who go into psychology.
Oh no.
So I'm sitting there like, no, there's got to be a reason behind this. And I think that's why I love psychological thrillers so much. And
Yeah.
true crime, because they do deeper dives into things like this, and it's really up my fucking alley. But yeah, so Ivan the Terrible could have been a very, very politically moving person if he was given the right opportunity. Whether or not his parents died early, if he had the support that he needed from the people around him, he could have boosted Russia. Like the Russia we know today could be completely different. I mean, probably not, but like I don't know. I just know that like the Romanovs faced a lot of assassination attempts. And Ivan the Terrible is not necessarily the like he didn't have any heirs that like descended into the Romanovs, but there is like the family tree around him
Yeah.
descended into the Romanovs.
And
And
his actions shape the history in general. And if
it
it's like the butterfly effect, if he had been a nice, loving monarch, then things may not have shaken out the way that they did. The Romanovs may never have come to power.
Yeah, and the thing too is that the people who are like the things that he reformed and made better and like increased like all of the trade, they could have been a powerful state of that time. Like they were a powerful state at that time for a short period of time. But if for some reason he didn't go off the deep end of his childhood trauma and succeeded in continuing the upward trend that Russia was seeing at that time, they could have been a whole new kind of country with a whole new thing. But his rulership defined generations. I mean, children were killed, watched their parents die. They were raised in fear, so that's all they knew. So they raised their children in fear. So it just was a never ending problem. History repeats itself.
It does.
It's
And does.
I love history so much. God damn. But yeah, so that is the final of the Tsar history. Um,
Yeah.
and the witch and the Tsar, world. So yeah.
Yay.
Until next time.
Bye.